everyone, I'm Mrs. McCulley, and this is a lesson on comparing biomes. So far you've learned how to identify and describe different biomes on Earth. Now you're ready to learn how to compare them to each other. So there's many ways this can be done. You can list the locations and types of plants and animals that live there, as you have done in previous lessons. But you can also compare them to each other by looking at data on graphs and charts. So let's start with our first example here. We have a precipitation graph for the temperate deciduous forest. Now let's learn how first to read the graph. So the x-axis on the bottom are the 12 months of the year. J for January, F for February, etc. Then over here on the y-axis you have the precipitation amount in millimeters. So if you wanted to read how much precipitation fell in the deciduous forest in January, you would come right up here, and you have about 50 millimeters of precipitation in January. Alright, now that you know how to read a point on the graph, the best way to compare biomes to each other with precipitation is to look at the trend. So how much rain falls and in what time of year. So for example, in the temperate deciduous forest, our driest months are in the winter. So here we have our lowest amount of rain in January, February, March, and then you see an increase right here in spring, a slight drop down in January, but then it still stays higher than the winter. And then you have most of your rainfall occurring in the spring, summer, and fall months before it finally decreases again in the winter. Now let's take a look at a desert precipitation graph in comparison to our temperate deciduous forest. Now what's interesting is they both have about 50 millimeters of rain in January, but other than that, they're very different. So whereas we had a wet summer here, in the desert you have a very dry summer, spring, summer, and fall. Great decrease in precipitation amount, almost to nothing. So basically you have no rain in the summer, and then again when it starts to cool off, you get an increase in precipitation, which is almost the exact opposite of the deciduous forest. Alright, let's try another one. So now we're going to compare the temperate deciduous forest to a grassland precipitation. Okay, so again we start out right here with 50 millimeters of rain in January. And there are some similarities here. We see a slight increase in the early spring, but then as it starts heating up, we see our driest months in the grassland in the summer before it starts to rebound in fall and increases until we have most of our rain occurring in the fall and winter. So it looks like we get a little bit more precipitation in the deciduous forest than in the grassland. And the grassland has a dry summer, whereas the deciduous forest has a wet summer. Alright, now let's look at one more comparison to the deciduous forest. So right here we have a tropical rainforest. Remember, it's warm pretty much year-round. A lot of rain. So look at these two next to each other. What do you notice that's different? Right, if you said that the wet season was right here in summer and fall, and it starts decreasing when it cools off a little bit. It doesn't have too much of a temperature difference in the winter, but as it cools off a little bit, then you see a drop in the amount of precipitation. Okay, so we have a very wet summer and fall, and then the least amount of rain and precipitation comes in winter and spring. Now you may have noticed something else about this graph, where we only have 140 millimeters here on the deciduous forest. The tropical rainforest goes all the way up to 300. So you have greater than 250 millimeters of rain in the fall. So that is quite a difference. So you can see right here from these graphs that the tropical rainforest produces a lot more precipitation than a deciduous forest. So in January alone, you have over 100 millimeters of rain. Alright, so another way we can compare biomes is by looking at temperature graphs right here. Here we have one for the temperate deciduous forest. This is the temperature. It's very similar to the precipitation graphs we just looked at. Again, we have the months of the year on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have the temperature ranging from -40 Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius. So for those of you who are used to Fahrenheit, I have put a conversion thermometer here. So when you have 0 degrees Celsius, that's freezing. That's about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So right here you can see that about 30 degrees Celsius is pretty warm. It's in the 80s in Fahrenheit. All right. Now looking at this graph, let's look at the trend. So in January we have about an average temperature in the deciduous forest of 0 degrees Celsius. That's freezing. 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So then it gradually, as spring comes along, warms up slowly until it gets pretty warm, and we have a hot summer, and then the temperature starts cooling off again in fall till we get to our coldest point here in winter. So this has 4 distinct seasons, so it's a nice little bell curve. Now let's compare it to a desert temperature graph. At first glance, they look pretty similar. However, if you notice, the temperature starts out much higher. So we have probably about 12 degrees Celsius right here. And then it doesn't change too much. It gets a little, we have a slight increase here as the summer months come on. But you can see it's generally within 10, 20 degrees difference. This one has a much larger difference between winter, 0 degrees, and summer, about 20 degrees. This one only ranges from about, about 12 degrees Celsius to 22. So you can see that this is pretty much warm all year long. Alright, this should be very helpful for you. Once you know how to read precipitation and temperature graphs and compare them to each other, you'll be able to compare more thoroughly the different biomes on Earth to each other.